The argument is that marriage is an oppressive tool, which I say, yes, it is. When motherhood became a biological choice for women, fatherhood became a social choice for men. It became socially acceptable for men to walk away from children in a way that it hadn't been before. Those high status men are able to really, really set the terms. If a woman doesn't, say, have sex on the first date, it's easy enough to find another woman who will. So you end up with a slightly artificial level of competition between women who, there are actually enough men to go around, but there aren't enough men that they actually want to be with to go around. And so they're competing for a minority of men who basically have, it's kind of open season. They can demand that their own preferences be met.
Louise Perry, it's very nice to meet you.
And you, what a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, this should be good. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on. I'm excited for this conversation. Before we get started, can you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
I am a British journalist based in London and a campaigner and the director of a think tank called The Other Half, which maybe we're going to talk about, which is we promote what we call commonsensefeminism.
Wow.
Yeah. and I'm an author of a new book called The Case Against Sexual Revolution.
Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Okay, this should be good. How much negativity do you get online?
Less than you'd think. I
Good.
thought that I'd get loads, but actually I would say 90% positive.
Well, you have a very nice,
Mm.
soft voice too. I
Maybe
don't think
that's
it
what it
like
is. Yeah.
people can't get mad at you, too mad at you. Oh, that's nice.
I think it might be the English accent as well.
Yeah, that's sneaky. That's it makes people sound smarter too. It's kind of like
Do
a
you think?
cheat code in life. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, this should be good. So what's your book? What's your book about? And what is common sense feminism? Let's start with what is common sense feminism actually?
I mean, partly it's a nice phrase that sort of confuses people. Ditto calling a book something like The Case Against the Social Revolution. It's a bit confounding, isn't it? What we're trying to do with The Other Half, the reason we called it The Other Half is because it's not only about talking about women, the other half of the human race, it's also about talking about the other half of life. Because my view that I put forward in the book is that what the feminist project has been, at least in the second half of the 20th century until now, has been about encouraging women to be more like men
Hmm.
in every possible way. So to imitate male sexuality, to gain access to the male sphere, to imitate the male life cycle in terms of things like prioritizing professional success over anything else, all this sort of stuff. And I think it is very clear and is becoming clearer over time that this isn't making women happy, and that actually most women do not see that as their aspiration in life. Most women want to either prioritize family life or to balance it against career. Most women want to spend more time with their children, not less. Most women want to aspire to stable and meaningful monogamous relationships rather than have sex like a man, as Sex and the City described it. And this is extremely obvious from polling. You ask British women and indeed American women all of these questions, and there's a fairly resounding majority, but that isn't what you hear represented in Westminster or indeed in Washington, because there's a really big gap between what most feminist lobbying organizations or advocacy organizations of all kinds and also in the media tend to represent as what women want and what women do actually want. So the project that we've set ourselves is to try and represent majority female opinion in the corridors of power.
Wow. Okay. Are you making any progress?
It's very early days, but yes, I would say yes.
Good. Good. Do you know the background of why the sexual revolution kind of pushed women towards acting more like men?
It's an interesting question. I think it's probably partly got to do with the women who formed the second wave. I think that the feminist culture of the 1970s, which was really focused in places like Greenwich Village in New York and a handful of other urban centers, and the women who wrote the most important texts of the second wave and went on to found organizations like Now, tended to be super, super well educated, super intelligent, super disagreeable, particularly
Ah,
disinclined towards things like family life. The whole from their point of view, they were really spurred on by a desire to reject the traditional feminine role, and often did so in quite spectacular ways. On a personal level, some of the biographies of second wavers are really, really unusual, really interesting. And so they obviously had preferences that are different from average female preferences, which isn't to say that everything that they campaigned for was kind of misaligned with what is good for most women. You know, things like setting up domestic violence shelters or setting up rape crisis centers. My first job working out of university was working in a rape crisis center. Those are the kind of institutions formed from the second wave, which are, you know, like really good. I don't think anyone, I think very few, even anti-feminists, would argue against the establishment of those kind of institutions. But I think they were also just generally geared towards aspiring to a more masculine way of living, just on the basis of self-selection and personality, than are most women. That would be my guess as to why the priorities kind of tended in that direction.
That's interesting. That totally makes sense too. A bunch of disagreeable, extremely smart women pushed society in a direction that doesn't represent the average woman. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Although I'd also say that I think that the feminist thinking has been important and has shaped our recent history in all sorts of important ways. But it all comes secondary to material changes, all of it. You know, I think it was Phyllis Schlafly who first said that the washing machine did more to liberate women than did feminist campaigning. I think this is evidently true, right? And there are so many ways in which our lives have dramatically changed within the last 100 years, not just the washing machine, but the pill, which has really forms the center of my book. The fact that we now are orientated much more towards a knowledge and service-based economy, which de-emphasizes manual work and physical strength, which of course men have more of. I think all of these things have pushed women out of the domestic sphere and into a more masculine roles. You know, it is good for GDP, to put it bluntly, to have women participating in the workforce. And when you have things like washing machines and central heating and microwaves and all these things which mean that the work of running a household just takes less time, it becomes more possible for women to do things like that. And when you can also delay childbearing through the pill and other contraception, women being more like men becomes possible and becomes actually economically productive. The problem is that there are all sorts of costs down the line from that, and actually including economic costs down the line from that, which mean that we're dealing with some quite painful trade-offs.
This episode is sponsored by NordVPN. If you followed the show for a while, then you've probably heard me complain about how bad Canadian Netflix is. It was bad as a teenager. It was annoying to go to America and see how good Netflix was. If you Americans don't know, it's bad. I mean, Netflix has been bad recently in America too, I suppose, but at least it has variety here. I used NordVPN to watch the best shows on Netflix and online anywhere in the world from Canada. Now that I live in Miami, I don't use NordVPN to watch good Netflix shows. But no matter where I go, I like to safeguard my online activity. NordVPN's state-of-the-art encryption protects you from third parties who want to watch what you're doing online. It also protects you from hackers, malware, and malicious people who might want to track your online activity. With their incredibly fast coverage, some VPNs are so slow. NordVPN's a simple way to guarantee your privacy and keep you safe online. It's super easy to start using, and it protects you from anyone knowing what websites you've been visiting. And I think given the political atmosphere right now, it's worth doing, just in case the government gets weird. Who knows? Grab your exclusive NordVPN deal by going to nordvpn.com/TMPP to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan, plus 4 months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can go there, see how fast it is, forget you're using a VPN, be protected. Sign up for NordVPN and enjoy this episode. Okay, wow. Well, I want to cover a bunch from what you just talked about. Let's start with economic trade-offs. So what are the economic trade-offs for having, I suppose, women in the workplace and less around children?
Because someone has to look after the children would be the first thing. So you have this slightly strange artifact of the way that we measure GDP, where if you have if a mother goes to work and hires a nanny to do her role, what was her role while she's at work, that appears to be economic growth, because you now have in that unit, you have mother, father, nanny all employed, as opposed to just having father employed. It's a misleading way of calculating that though, because there's, you know, the domestic work that was previously unpaid is still being done. It's exactly the same work. It's just being done by someone else and for a wage. And of course there's all sorts of sort of friction in that system that wouldn't be there otherwise, because you've got 3 rotating parts that need to lock together, unlike in the single earner household where you just have the one, and then you have specialization between mother and father, and you have mother specializing in the domestic work. Instead, when you introduce the paid component, everything becomes much more complex, much more liable for collapse. So interestingly, it was Elizabeth Warren, of all people, who wrote a book some decades ago called The Two Income Trap, about the fact that
I've heard of that.
yeah, when both parents are in paid employment, the household becomes dependent on both of them being in paid employment, and there's much less room for slack. Whereas what you would have had previously is women kind of dipping in and out of the workforce, particularly working class women, dipping in and out of the workforce when, say, children are a bit older, or when fathers' earnings have suffered and they need a bit of extra money. And female labour participation becomes a sort of a variable that can change over time depending on economic circumstances. Whereas if all families are dependent on 2 full-time incomes, there's no room for slack. There's no source of other income if hard times come along. And what's more, you will end up competing with. So the lump of labour fallacy, obviously, you know, it's not quite true that you end up with wages halved by women entering the workforce, because women entering the workforce does grow the economy in all sorts of ways. But there are certain products, like housing, for instance. If you have a fixed supply of housing in, say, a good school district, and everyone is competing to buy that housing, and everyone is competing with 2 incomes rather than 1, you do end up in a situation, which I think we're in now, where in order to have a good standard of living, you have to have 2 incomes, unless you have one extraordinarily high earner.
So is that a result of women going back to work, or going to work in the first place? Is that actually a direct result of that, or did the increase in housing prices come first?
There are other things contributing to housing prices, including, I mean, the thing that is most often spoken about in the political discourse on this is the lack of building, which clearly is a factor. It's a fact as well in somewhere like the UK that you have this extreme concentration of high-earning jobs in London, and in other parts of the world you have this concentration of high-earning jobs in the major cities. So you will expect, you know, house prices in San Francisco to rocket because Silicon Valley is based nearby. There are other factors, but I think it is absolutely the case that joint mortgages, the fact that you now have 2 incomes competing for the same product, for the housing that everyone wants, has made it more difficult for people to live on single incomes. And look, there are advantages of women being in the work. I mean, I say this, look at me, I'm working, right? There are advantages of women being in the workforce in all sorts of ways. Women having, you know, we mentioned domestic violence briefly, that if women have separate sources of income and want to escape an abusive marriage, that's clearly advantageous. The fact that women on average are as intelligent as men, have all sorts of skills that are actually really well suited to modern economy. The fact that women are more agreeable than men is actually great in a service economy, for instance. And increasingly, I'd say that office culture and all sorts of corporate culture is increasingly feminine, and actually women can really, really flourish in that kind of environment. So I think that the idea that we can just sweep women out of public life and go back to the 1950s, which is of course an unusual decade, I don't think that's going to happen, even if we wanted it to. But these trade-offs exist, as with any complex historical change.
Interesting. Okay. You spoke about the birth control pill. I'm very interested in that. I know when I was young, I was put on the birth control when I was 14. I think for my skin, you know, because you get, and
Classic, yeah.
I didn't stop taking it until I was 23, when I started reading about what the birth control does to your brain and the side effects it can cause, and generally does cause. That's what I've figured out since, right? Like depression, things like that. Can you get into what you think the birth control's done to society?
It's interesting to talk about I mean, I don't really write in the book about the personal side effects of birth control pill, but so many women experience it, and just anecdotally, I know so many women who've said they came off the pill and their personalities completely changed.
Yeah.
And they realized how, because as you say, if you go on it as a teenager for acne and then you're still on it for decades,
You don't even know. You don't even know. Also, if you're having a moody teenage phase, then and the moodiness never ends, then you don't identify the issues as the pill. It's
Yeah,
extremely problematic. Yeah. Especially if you've
yeah,
been taking it for so long, you don't even notice. It's like a vitamin.
yeah. And it shouldn't surprise us really, because we're meddling with very, very
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
hormones, which have all sorts of far-reaching effects that we don't really understand. I mean, we don't, as a species, we don't really understand our reproductive system at all.
Yeah.
And all of the efforts to do things like growing babies outside of the womb or sex change or, you know, any of these sort of ambitious scientific projects, they're going nowhere. Like, let's be real. It
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
so much more complex than anyone can actually grasp. I think we're a long way away from being able to do that kind of radical
Yeah, for
transformation,
sure.
even if we'd want to. I think the idea of growing, I personally find it incredibly dystopian, the idea of growing babies outside of the human body.
Oh, and it's so narcissistic too. It's like, oh, we're smart enough to figure this out. Like, that's just a narcissistic way of thinking,
Yes.
I think.
Imagine a newborn who'd never heard his or her mother's heartbeat. I just find that
Oh,
astonishing. Yeah, I know.
you with
I
your
know.
like English accent too. This is like worse. That
Making it.
description's worse. Yeah. Oh, that's so
um,
sad.
yeah. So the pill, yeah. I mean, so in terms of the social consequences of it, I don't think that we should be surprised that for the first time in the history of the world, reliably separating sex from reproduction has had some pretty massive effects, and that those effects have been both positive and negative and vast, right? And the thing that you notice happening across, if you know you look at the social effects in the decade or two immediately following the introduction of the pill, remembering that it came in two waves. So initially the pill was made available to married women only, and then it was made available to unmarried women as well.
Ah,
And then not long afterwards, you have, I mean, the timeline in Britain and America and other Western nations is all about the same. Not long afterwards, you then get the decriminalization of abortion. And then not long afterwards, you see the shotgun marriage ends as an institution. You see marriage rates of all kind falling off a cliff, but you also see the shotgun marriage, which had existed to deal with unwanted childbearing, disappears as a social tool. And the really perverse outcome of the pill, which is a beautiful example of the fact that human beings are very, very complicated and our societies are very complicated. You can't predict how technology shocks are going to affect them. You see rates of single motherhood rise. Who would have thought that would happen, right? You introduce a technology which allows women to regulate their fertility, and it leads to a rise in single motherhood. But I think the reason for that is because the pill isn't 100% effective. No form of contraception is. And actually the early pill in particular, you've got quite a high failure rate. But you end up with the absolute amount of premarital sex goes up, and therefore some portion of that is going to result in an unwanted pregnancy, and some women, for whatever reason, don't want to have an abortion, and so you'll end up with unexpected babies. And when the social institutions that used to exist to regulate fertility, like marriage, have all fallen away as a result of the pill's introduction. That's, I mean, the phrase I use in the book, which isn't original to me, I can't remember who first said it, but when motherhood became a biological choice for women, fatherhood became a social choice for men. And it became socially acceptable for men to walk away from children in a way that it hadn't been before. Not to say that there hadn't always been cases of scoundrels, you know, impregnating women and then leaving, but it is now, the deadbeat dad is now completely socially acceptable in a way that he wasn't before, and is really in a way that one of the winners of the sexual revolution, because there's now no I mean the rates of non-payment of child support are astonishingly high, and it shouldn't surprise us that single mothers are some of the is the group of people most likely to be in poverty, while married mothers are least likely to be, which is why I have a chapter at the end of my book where I make a feminist case for marriage and say that actually marriage is completely in the interest of mothers and of children.
that doesn't surprise me at all.
But that has probably been the most controversial chapter from feminist readers.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
well, yeah, I suppose. If you don't think about it, then it would be
yeah.
difficult to wrap your head around, I suppose.
The argument is that marriage is an oppressive tool,
Hmm.
which I say, yes, it is. Or maybe repressive would be a better way of phrasing it, in that the whole point of it as an institution is that you make a promise and you're obliged to keep a promise. And that means that your freedom is limited. There are things that you can't do anymore once you've entered into that kind of institution. But that applies just as much to men as it does to women. The purpose of the institution is that it is controlling. But the principle being, once you've established this unit, legally bound together, socially bound together, spiritually bound together, if you understand in a religious sense, then that is the basis from which you can form family. So it's a kind of, it is, yes, it's a means of control and repression, but it's one that permits your life to begin as a family. And also, and means, in extremis, that the nature of sexual asymmetry, which despite all of recent efforts by the trans movement and so on, isn't going away, right? Men and women are profoundly different on a cellular level. I find it really interesting that the campaign to deny the existence of biological differences between men and women has arisen at exactly the same time and become perversely successful at exactly the same time that actually we're understanding more and more about how profoundly we do differ.
Ooh, let's get into that. Okay. How do women and men differ? You said on a cellular level.
Yeah. So in the obvious ways, women are the ones who get pregnant, men are not. We are smaller and weaker than men, particularly in terms of upper body strength. So the force that a woman can apply through a punch is about half as much as a man, which is a lot, right? And this is why you see in elite athletics, the difference between male and female athletes is huge. I do wonder whether the people, the progressives who are most in denial about the differences between men and women physically, I cannot help but suspect that they don't do a lot of sports. Because I think that if you participate particularly in strength-based sports or like martial arts or anything like that, it's going to become immediately apparent that men and women are profoundly different in this dimension.
They're just hanging out with all the like spindly artist types.
Very indoorsy.
Yeah.
So there's those which ought to be obvious to everyone, but there are also all sorts of really interesting ways, like women's immune systems are very different from men's. As we saw with COVID, men were more likely to die from COVID, and it was partly to do with things like men, certain lifestyle factors that might make a difference, but it was also just to do with our immune systems and the fact that we have to have immune systems which are able to accommodate the presence of an alien being and through pregnancy. So it has to be different. Women are more prone therefore to having autoimmune diseases, and
much more
prone to things like osteoporosis. I mean, a host of things where you see massive sex differences. There's increasingly moves towards in pharmaceuticals, moves towards creating drugs that are actually have different formulations for men and for women, because of the recognition that actually our systems are so profoundly different that it's not, we can't just consider women to be smaller men, which is normally what you do in dosing. You have to regard men and women as actually having some really fundamental differences, which mean that our drug interactions are different. And yes, this is happening exactly the same time that you have this like political discussion around whether or not women even exist as a category. We're not just sort of gender goo.
Did you see the clip going around of it was somebody suggesting that the heartbeat at 6 weeks was manufactured by the patriarchy?
I think I saw a little bit of that. American politician, was that right?
Yeah, that's where we're at. This episode of the podcast was sponsored by Paleo Valley Beef Sticks. If you want to lose weight and be hotter, eat beef sticks instead of eating junk. It's an easy switch, and they honestly taste better than junk anyway. And they fill you up, but they don't make you want to keep eating. Who doesn't want beef sticks? Everyone likes beef sticks. People who say they don't like beef sticks are lying. Paleo Valley is my go-to company for my kid for beef sticks. Paleo Valley's beef sticks, I've said beef sticks a lot, are made from 100% grass-fed and finished beef. Not only are their cows grass-fed, but the spices they use to flavor their beef sticks are also 100% organic, and it's all produced right here in the USA. Paleo Valley also puts their beef sticks through a natural fermentation process, which helps feed your microbiome. So these are the most gut-friendly beef sticks on the market, and a snack you can eat that'll fill you up, won't make you crash, and is healthy. Head over to paleovalley.com to check out their beef sticks today. That's PALEOVALLEY.com for 100% grass-fed beef sticks. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
Yeah, I mean, but whether or not we want it to, sexual asymmetry is not going anywhere. And there has been such a reluctance among most feminists to grapple with it, particularly, I think I'd say particularly now, but it's a long-standing issue when it comes to the psychological differences between men and women, the differences above the neck. Some feminists, radical feminists in particular, are completely au fait with the differences below the neck, and will recognize the importance of things like strength differences. But the fact that there are average differences, but very apparent ones at the population level, is more difficult if what you're aspiring to is equality. And as I said at the top, if your interpretation of equality is women being more like men, the fact that there are these psychological differences that affect our behavior and our preferences is quite difficult to reconcile. So things like women are more agreeable than men are on average, women are more neurotic than men are on average, and the fact that our sexuality differences are very obvious at the population level. Yes, there are exceptions, but in general, men have more unrestricted sociosexuality. They're more interested in having casual sex, in watching porn, in buying sex. Men are much more likely to have paraphilias or fetishes than women are, much more likely, with a few notable and interesting exceptions. So, for instance, women are more likely to be masochists and so on. But in all other paraphilias, men are wildly in the lead. And these are all things that have become much more socially acceptable post-sexual revolution. All preferences are much more likely to be found in men than they are in women. And something like porn or prostitution or casual sex, not only are men more likely to be interested in these things, but they also depend on women in order to enjoy them, right? Which therefore places demands on women. I think that what we basically have seen post-sexual revolution is if you understand two bell curves for men and women along the sociosexuality scale, it's not a conspiracy. This isn't to do with some exceptions. This isn't generally to do with men putting sort of interpersonal pressure on women. It's got more to do with culture and a new incentive structure post-pill. But what you're basically seeing is the bell curve sort of trying to be dragged upwards towards the male end, and women being encouraged to behave more like men in every possible way. And I think in a lot of cases it's making women miserable, which is why I wrote the book. It's making a lot of men miserable too. I'd say the only group who have really profited from this change in sexual culture are very high status men.
What about very disagreeable, intelligent women?
I'd say in the workplace, absolutely. In terms of sexuality, I mean, there are women who are very high or very unrestricted sociosexuality, I should say properly, genuinely do enjoy casual sex, genuinely do want to watch porn, genuinely are interested in all kinds of sexual adventure and experimentation. Those women do absolutely exist, but they are rare.
Yeah.
And they will always suffer from the risks associated with casual sex, like the risk of unwanted pregnancy, the fact that women being smaller and weaker means that in any encounter between a man and a woman on their own, the woman is almost always going to be much more physically at risk of violence. Most men can kill most women with their bare hands, but not vice versa. So even a woman who genuinely really loves casual sex, genuinely is really, really driven to have as many partners as possible, aside from any cultural pressure put on her, she's always going to run a risk in any encounter. And I think you have to really want to have casual sex for that risk to outweigh the benefit to you. So yes, there are women who are exceptions to this. There are also men who are exceptions to this. And I think it's worth emphasizing that male sexuality is quite flexible. Not in terms of sexual orientation. There's an interesting difference between the sexes, that women are much more likely to be bisexual than men are. 7% of men are straight. But they are flexible in terms of their short-term versus long-term strategy. So there are circumstances in which it's adaptive for men to want to have casual sex and to, in theory, men can conceive a child every time they orgasm, which is obviously not true for women because we have much greater physical input into reproduction. So you can see why women would have evolved to be much more choosy about their mates and much more careful about having sex than are men. And there is I describe it in the book as CAD mode. There's CAD mode for men is being driven towards being as promiscuous as you possibly can get away with, But the other mode for men, which I call dad mode, is orientated towards finding a wife, having children, investing in those children, investing in that unit, stability, there is, and there's an element of personal preference. So some men are just more likely to be drawn towards one mode or the other, but there's also an incentive factor and a culture factor that if it's advantageous in that moment for you to do one or the other, and if your culture is telling you to do one or the other, then that's going to drag men, in one or other direction. And I think what we see post-sexual revolution in our sexual culture is the incentives are all towards pad mode.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think a lot of that's how you're raised as well, and who your friends are. And I think for me growing up, I went to an art school in high school, so I was in a very liberal crowd. I didn't even know like what a conservative person was until like 2016, really. Like I didn't know any conservatives. And there was definitely a stigma around getting married, settling down, even dating somebody for a long period of time. It was pretty intense. It was very difficult to find somebody who's interested in being married eventually. It did happen. Like I did have some friends that were like, "Oh no, I want to find somebody and settle down." And I think that was because of how they were raised. There was a big emphasis put on that's the right way to live. And for families that had a more difficult time or were somewhat broken, then there was less emphasis put on that. And then those are the people who still aren't married and are still kind of screwing around at like 32, which is also, which you probably get into, not that risky for a man, but very difficult if they're dating a 32-year-old woman who wants to have kids.
Completely. And yeah, because it's going back to the limits of medical technology, right? We do have things like IVF and surrogacy, which supposedly extends the biological clock. But the failure rate of IVF is pretty amazing, particularly when it comes to age-related infertility. For other causes of infertility, IVF is quite good. But for age-related infertility, it's honestly close to being a scam.
Is that when you harvest eggs late?
So I think that the age of the eggs does matter quite a lot. So if you harvest them early and then do IVF later. But even then, do you remember there was that woman who appeared on the cover of Time because she was one of the early people to invest in egg freezing. And she did it because she was in a very high-powered job, I think in New York. And it was advantageous career-wise for her to delay childbearing. And so she was this kind of glamorous shot on the cover of Time magazine and her promoting this route to liberation for women. And then some years later, she went to actually use the eggs and discovered that almost all of them had been destroyed in the process. It was just devastating. It's by no means a guarantee. And I got to say, when you see employers offering things like egg freezing to their young female employees, this is increasingly a perk of jobs in certain places, particularly say Silicon Valley, or offering surrogacy services or all these other things. They are doing it because it's in their interests.
Yeah.
They are not doing it because it's a very, very risky route to go down in terms of your chances of actually having a live child at the end of the process. But it is this unfortunate fact that a crucial moment in your professional life maps on exactly to your fertility window, which is actually quite short, and it has proved very difficult to expand it. It's a funny thing that we can keep people alive for a long time, and until recently life expectancy just ticked up and up. I mean, it's now falling because of things like deaths of despair, but that's the great story of the 20th and 21st centuries. Life expectancy just goes up and up, but our fertility window doesn't. And if anything, all of our social systems are completely massed against it. The healthiest time really to be having children is in your early 20s. And yet that's exactly when we've got everyone is in education. You don't own a home.
I know,
you're not married or in a relationship. Like everything is completely inappropriate for child rearing in a social sense. In a biological sense, it's perfect timing, but that's not the priority. also things like we struggle to keep people healthy for a long time. So yes, you stay alive for a long time, but from say the age of 70, you're going to expect to have a lot of health problems, to be so much less physically able than you once were, normally not really able to work, depending on what kind of work you do, certainly not able to do manual work. We've managed to extend old age, but not health. It's just the limits of medical technology never cease to amaze me.
So I've had a difficult time. I grew up in like my dad was traditional, right? My mom stayed at home, so I had a stay-at-home mom, and I was always I had this kind of a difficult time understanding what I was supposed to do because on one hand I was told getting a PhD was massively important, going to university was massively important, but also you should be a stay-at-home mom. And I can remember as a teenager like adding up the years and being like, okay, if it's
Yeah.
easiest to have kids in your 20s, but I'm also supposed to get a PhD. And it wasn't even bachelor degrees, like that's for sure, but like PhD is what you really want. It's like, how do I do both? And I can remember just being like, I don't know if I can. Like, I don't know if I can do both unless, like, I don't know how I can do both. And then I had some health problems, which delayed schooling and was like, okay, well, now the years are completely off. I'm not going to get a PhD till I'm like 31. And then like how do you balance everything in there? And I think I had a difficult time understanding what the average female is like because I'm extremely disagreeable, and for my entire life I thought everybody else was just like me. Like it wasn't until I was 24. I have no idea why this was because my dad being who he is, I knew people had personality differences, but I couldn't wrap my head around what those actually manifested like. So when I had conversations, I couldn't understand why people acted differently in conversations than I did till I was like 24. I don't know if other people have that problem, but it took me a long time. And it was difficult for me to figure out what I should feel like. And so the conversation is interesting because I don't think I think like the average female because my disagreeableness is so high. What do you think the average female looks like? What do you think they
Agreeable.
want?
I'm super
Agreeable.
agreeable. So yeah, so which I do think actually is a real factor in all this sexual culture stuff. So a question I get sometimes is, why are women putting up with this? Why would women put up with a culture that is not geared towards their preferences? Just anecdotally, and also in media culture, whatever, you see so many examples of women who will um, go along with situationships, so called, right, or have casual sexual relationships without any kind of commitment, without even displays of affection, which they desperately crave, and will do pornified sex acts that they don't enjoy, that they don't really want to do, but they're trying to please this man, whatever. And the question is, why would women put up with this when in general women are generally the sex with more choices when it comes to mates, because we know from all the dating app data, which has proved to be so useful for sex researchers, that the hypergamy instinct in women, the subconscious desire to marry up and to be drawn towards higher status men than oneself, which men don't have. Men are quite happy to generally have relationships with women of the same or lower status than themselves, but women are not, means that you end up with women kind of clustering towards the higher status men. I think the figures on Tinder is it's like 10% of men get 60% of likes, the top 10% of men, that is, and then the bottom 90% are getting very little, whereas women are generally get a lot of likes, but they're getting likes from men that they're not interested in. And I think that what's going on is because you've lifted the monogamy restriction, not legally, polygamy is still illegal, at least in the UK. That is probably the next frontier.
Yeah.
The polyamorous are going to start clamoring to have their relationships recognized in law. But for now, it's still illegal. But in practice, because premarital and extramarital sex is now socially acceptable, these high status men who in previous era would have got married and would have removed themselves from the dating pool instead are able to be serially monogamous, or even able to have simultaneous relationships with women who might not even realize they're part of these harems, right, digital harems. And I think that's why those women end up, those high status men are able to really, really set the terms because if a woman doesn't, say, have sex on the first date, it's easy enough to find another woman who will. So you end up with a slightly artificial level of competition between women who, you know, there are actually enough men to go around, but there aren't enough men that they actually want to be with to go around. And so they're competing for a minority of men who basically have, I mean, it's kind of open season. They can demand that their own preferences be met.
So what's the solution here? Now that we're in this predicament.
I mean, on an individual level, it is quite possible for people to just choose to be a bit more trad. The challenge is, of course, finding a partner who wants that too. But I'm noticing around me a quite a significant turn against this stuff. It's increasingly common in elite circles as well. You know, there's this apparent turn towards Catholicism among young New Yorkers, and I see it among young Londoners as well, a greater conservatism among a sort of subsection of the elite. You can choose to do that. You know, you can still get married, you can still not have premarital sex, you can still choose to be a stay-at-home mum, have loads of children. I mean, it's more difficult because things like being a stay-at-home mum in an economic environment where that's really challenging is just harder than it used to be. You won't have the social support that you used to have if that's the route that you're choosing. You will forgo status to some extent, but it's still possible. So I do have advice for readers along those lines. You know, you I think that one change that could come about quite easily is just, I think part of the, sorry, I was saying before that part of the reason why you see women putting up with nonsense is because of the hypergamy effect. But I think the other reason is to do with agreeableness. And agreeable people just find it really difficult to be assertive in those situations. And when, for instance, the norm becomes having sex on a first date, and indeed the norm becomes having sex before marriage per se, you know, it used to be that if the social expectation was that you wouldn't have sex before marriage, then there's no conversation. It is just assumed after a date that, you know, we will not be having sex. That's the default. Now the default is to have sex. And that means that women are put in this situation, sometimes very agreeable women who are really keen to please these, you know, these desirable men, whatever, where they have to be defending their own sexual boundaries, even if they're actually quite reluctant. And it's often what you see in Me Too cases, where women are describing situations where they're with a man who potentially they are actually quite romantically interested in after a date, whatever. Aziz Ansari was the famous example. Do you remember that one? The actor Aziz Ansari, who had a date with a woman, went back to his place, and she didn't want to have sex. He did. He didn't rape her. There wasn't anything illegal that happened. She never really said no, but she also was a bit reluctant, and made it evident non-verbally that she was reluctant. He apparently didn't think so. And they ended up having sex, and she felt really violated and felt really distressed, and she later wrote about this, and it became a whole thing. She had to express what happened in the terms of consent, and so the conversation that happened afterwards was this really consensual? What was this sexual assault, etc.? I think the answer to that is no, it wasn't sexual assault on a legal level, but it also wasn't good.
Yeah.
And he didn't behave well, and he didn't behave like a gentleman, right, is what you would have said historically. He didn't behave like a gentleman. He didn't demonstrate chivalry. He put pressure on a woman who he ought to have recognized was reluctant. But the thing is that when the expectation, particularly when you're talking about a fan going on a date with a celebrity, which is the circumstances there, and they've gone back to his house, the expectation was that they would have sex. And so it was incumbent on her to be assertive and to say no. And agreeable people find that really hard. So I think that's very often what's going on. And I think that if there's one change that could happen quite swiftly, potentially, is if we had a bit of a change in norms and expectations, and if women felt more confident in demanding certain things. I hear so often from young women in particular this, I'm afraid of being frigid, I'm afraid of being a prude, I'm afraid of being considered low status because I don't want to do X, Y, Z. If the status flipped and different expectations were in place, then I think you would see women and therefore men behaving quite differently, because women are the gatekeepers, most of the time. What you see now, for instance, at the moment, is there's this dreadful phenomenon on TikTok of young women showing off their bruises that they've got from having rough sex with their boyfriends, like really young women, teenagers, say that they've got bruises on their neck, and they'll like take TikToks of them, and this is considered to be really desirable. I think all women will show off about how many partners they've had. I think that that's coming from a misunderstanding of male sexuality. I think that because we're all kind of collectively in denial about how profoundly different men and women are on the cellular level, as we were saying, but also psychologically. And I think that a lot of young women don't realize that men are much more geared towards having emotionless sex than they are.
Yeah.
And actually are much more willing to have sex
Yeah.
with women. They wouldn't care if they got hit by a bus next week, frankly. And so things like being able to entice a man into bed or to have rough sex or whatever, is not actually much of an achievement. It's pretty easy to do that, particularly as a young woman. But because of that misunderstanding of the fact that men regard sex quite differently from women, I think that these young women don't know that because they've not learned it yet, and because the culture completely misinforms them about reality. I think that if they did know that, I don't think they'd be putting these videos on TikTok.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of modest aim to let them know.
It's a good aim. I agree. I think that's kind of similar to my misunderstanding of personality differences till I was 24. I knew, but I didn't understand what that looked like. I think that probably goes for differences between men and women too. I still have a hard time with that. Like even with my husband, and I am fully educated in the differences between men and women, and I still have a hard time understanding why responses to situations can differ between us. And it's because I mean, I have that issue with looking at other women as well. But I think it's very hard for people to understand how different men and women can be, or people can be from each other. It's tricky.
I found that having a baby, actually, I mean, I like you, I knew these things academically. I found that having a baby made them really, really apparent. The sense in which we are sort of slaves to our biology, and actually we don't have nearly as much control over our instincts and our behaviors as we think, because the way in which maternal and paternal instincts differ, for instance, is really striking. And particularly so my son's 16 months old now. You know that instinct to check that your baby's breathing?
Yeah.
Which everyone does. I didn't know initially that was a natural thing to do. And so you feel a bit crazy constantly going in and checking the baby's breathing. But then I still do it occasionally, but when they're newborn, you do it all the time. I found out recently that apparently chimpanzee mothers do that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, isn't it?
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. And my husband doesn't do that. Or a little bit maybe, but it's not the same kind of desperate drive towards like, I've got to check the baby's breathing, which all of my mum friends have said they have as well. These things are deep.
Yeah, they are. The thing that I noticed, the thing that I noticed when I have a 5-year-old daughter, this was very strange, and I thought this was on a serious biological level, is as soon as she was born, I couldn't sleep. I don't know what your experience was, but I used to be able to sleep through anything, wherever, whenever. And then as soon as she was born, it was like she just breathed funny, right? Like it's not crying. She'd be like, just like this tiny little, and it'd be like an electric zap through my body, and I'd be awake. I was like, that's crazy. And she's 5 now, and it hasn't gone away. So I sleep with like a mask and white noise. And if my husband moves, then I'm kind of awake. And that wasn't the case before. And it happened as soon as she was born. Did that happen to you with noises?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's exhausting.
It really is. And I found as well that so initially we didn't co-sleep because I was so scared of all the SIDS stuff, and then ended up kind of gradually letting him stay in the bed. And I did that partly because I read about like the anthropology of infant sleep and the fact that infants sleeping in the same beds as their mothers, crucially, not their fathers. So it's not safe to have fathers sleep with the infant.
Yeah.
It is safe to have mothers sleep with the infant as long as there are certain like risk factors aren't present, like prematurity, and mother has to not be on sleeping drugs or drunk or anything like that. But that in most circumstances, it is safe for mothers to sleep with a baby, because you are so attuned to them all the time. You're not going to roll over your baby. And actually what you end up doing instinctively is forming a C shape around the baby, where you have like your arm. And you do it in your sleep. You don't even know it completely. And that is apparently the natural thing, the C shape. It's what they write about in infant sleep studies.
Like this?
Well, or like on your arm, and then with your legs, like a little.
Oh, that's so cool. Okay, I did that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's because your body is like completely set on this. I found as well when in the early weeks in particular, I would only ever dream about my son. I didn't dream about anything else. And if I closed my eyes, I could see his face. Like I had that level of constant attunement towards the baby, which then gradually lapses with time. And that link becomes a little bit less, but they talk about the fourth trimester. We give birth to our babies too early, really, and so you have to have this intense dependency initially.
It's crazy.
Which has all sorts of social effects, obviously, as well, because it's a very uncomfortable. If you're a liberal individualist and you're all about people having autonomy, then motherhood is a huge problem, because mothers can't be autonomous, and there's this really, you're not really talking about two individuals when you talk about a mother and a baby, because the baby definitely can't be considered in that way, because he or she is just completely dependent on other people for staying alive. But mothers also are so emotionally drawn towards their baby. Even if you've got formula, even if you've got daycare, even if you've got all these things which can kind of physically lessen the dependency, that emotional link is insane. And try as you might, trying to persuade mothers to break it, if that's your social project, you're going to fail.
That's also cruel. It would have been so much easier. Like I had Scarlett, she's 5, so I had her 5 years ago, and it really decimated my social life. Like, and I was prepared for that, but it would have been so much. Like, there's a reason most women aren't doing that. Right? Especially if you're in a more liberal circle, because you have a kid and you're 25 or like 24 or 23, even 26. It's like, okay,
I was 29 and
no
I felt
friends.
Really young. Yeah.
I know, 29 even.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and then you're the only person, especially if you're like, probably if you're educated or if you're more liberal, you're the only person in your friend group that has a kid. I had responses from friends that are like, oh, you're ruining your life. And like that was, and then the neighborhood I moved into at the time too, I was looked down on. Like I had a kid and they're like, well, what's your job? It was these older women too, these like 56-year-old women were like, oh, you're just staying at home?
Gosh.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow. So now my entire social circle is broken. My neighborhood, everyone in my neighborhood is 15 years older than me with the kids that are the same age. It was just like,
I have the same.
Good luck with that. And it's worth it for sure. It's worth it. And I think trying to, like, I appreciate what you're doing, because what needs to happen, I think, is it needs to be made cool again, because women need it, right? It needs to be cool. It needs to be cool to be a gentleman. It needs to be cool to be a dad. Like it's so attractive to have a man say, hey, I want you to have babies with me and I want to take care of you. Like that is so attractive. I don't know when that stopped being attractive.
I think it still is.
It is, but
it's just, it's just persuading people. I know. I completely agree. And it also ends up with this slightly unfortunate that I found around here, because we live in London, and we're in one of these parts of London where, like at my hospital, the average age for first baby was like late 30s, the average age.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was including, where I gave birth covered an area with quite a high South Asian immigrant population, where women were having babies a lot younger. So it was that balanced with the upper middle class women who were having them really late. And also most women go back to work quite quickly. So you find quite soon that if you want to be stay at home, or if, like me at the time, I was at home part of the week, you have no one to hang out with.
I know it's
Everyone's at
rough.
work. And also you
It's
don't have many
rough.
friends who have children, so they're all at work, obviously. And their social schedule isn't going to fit in with you. You know, you want to be having like mid-morning socializing. You can't be doing late nights and stuff. It's difficult breaking
It's
from.
sad.
Yeah, you have to seek out people who are also making your eccentric decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully that'll become more and more common. It was so
Yeah.
interesting. I spent a period of time in Serbia, and if you went out to like the streets, or there people would hang out at like little coffee shops, there were people my age that would have two or three kids with their
Mm,
friends, like
mm,
that would also have two or three kids.
mm-hmm.
And the like men are drinking beer, women are drinking coffee or having a beer. Kids are like running around them. And they were 28-year-olds.
And
And
it's
they
normal.
had
Yeah,
kids
yeah.
from like a kid on their lap and then two kids that were under 5. And I can remember looking at that and being like, they're having a good time. That looks like fun. They haven't
Mm-hmm.
lost their lives. They still have friends. They're out
Mm-hmm.
socializing, but their kids are there. I was like, that just doesn't exist here. And then when I was in Russia, they have restaurants set up so that you'll have a really nice like steakhouse restaurant. And at one area of the restaurant, they'll hire, it's generally like a kind of a grandmother type person that'll you can give your kid
Really? Like
to
a
for
crash.
dinner. Yeah, and they'll
Nice.
entertain your kid, and it's just part of the
Oh, that's
restaurant. Or
amazing.
they'll
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah.
little rooms that are full of toys so parents can go and you can say, "Hey, you know, here's a kid for
Mm,
a few hours. The kids have a blast. Parents get a break, but
mm,
society is set up so that people can do that. And
mm,
that
mm.
like those types of institutions don't exist at all here. For
Unless they're super deliberate. So I'm going on a weekend soon, which is put on by a conservative think tank. And because they're very deliberately pro-family, they are deliberately providing
okay,
childcare.
good.
Everything is family orientated, but that's not normal.
That's
So I
good.
initially thought, oh, I can't possibly go because I don't, and I spoke to them and they said, no, no, this is genuinely
They've
pro-family.
made it. Yeah.
Yeah, but you have to go that extra mile. It was also something, to be fair, that a lot of feminists did, like doing conferences in the second wave times, doing conferences and providing crashes, because if children
That
can't
would have been
participate, then
helpful.
mothers
Yeah.
can't participate because they come as a package. um I think also this thing of the fact that we don't really see kids running around in restaurants and stuff, I think it's also because that feeling of social disapproval. I think we've never had a time, probably in human history, where so many adults have no experience of children,
Mm-hmm.
because you
Mm-hmm.
can now make it a really long time and never have held a baby, because you're not likely to have a lot of siblings who are having kids. You're not likely all of your friends are also delaying childbearing. You're not really seeing kids out and about. You can reach the age of 40 or something and you've basically never been in charge of a child. I mean, I used to work as a nanny when
Yeah,
I
me
was younger,
too.
so I'm unusual in that sense. um but I, it's kind of no wonder that you have people sort of whinging about children on airplanes and women and
Yeah.
children in restaurants, all this stuff. Like, children are members of society too. I mean, there's one thing to obviously complain about parents not being sufficiently attentive, but just
Yeah,
children
definitely.
cry, children, like they behave differently from grown-ups. And you kind of have to learn, you just have to learn that from being around them. And I think that as a society, we're increasingly not familiar with what children are like, which then makes it more difficult to, as a parent, to be bringing children into places like restaurants or churches.
Mm.
Think how noisy churches must have been
I
in
feel
the
like
previous era.
I can almost remember, and I'm 30. I feel like when I was a kid, the weddings I went to, and I went to church. I didn't go to church often. I went to church a few times, but I remember every time I went to one of those events, a baby would cry, and then someone would get
Mm,
up and go outside with a baby. That was just
mm-hmm.
the norm at those events, and now it's not.
Including a child-free weddings. Have you come across these? I've not
Oh,
yet been invited to a
constantly.
child-free wedding, but this is apparently a thing.
I
This is
think that's the
apparently
norm.
legit
I think
now.
it's the norm. I think that also has to
Crazy.
do with it is crazy. I think
Yeah.
it has to do with how much people are spending on weddings as well.
Yeah. So I
Like
can
I
see how
think
you
that's
don't,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which I think as well, is a consequence of is a consequence of the pill, because because well, well, a consequence of the death of the marriage institution, which is downstream of the pill, because I think that now It is so easy to get divorced. There's so much less permanence in general attached to marriage that I think people don't feel as if it has much inherent meaning anymore. Whereas, you know, back in the day where you really couldn't get divorced, if you just show up to, if you go to Gretna Green, just you two and a witness, you've completely transformed your life. Even if the day was pretty trivial in all other senses and you didn't spend any money on it, you've completely transformed your life. Whereas now you haven't actually, and everyone kind of knows that. So I think people try and invest meaning by spending money and making it into a massive event and having these kind of big society weddings, which were not normal for, say, our grandparents' generation. People didn't spend that kind of big reception dinner and everything. That was what people did in the upper classes. That wasn't a normal. Whereas now it's expected, and it ends up, of course, being another impediment to getting married, because if you can't afford to have a big wedding, then you might delay it and not invite children, which are actually the whole point of marriage, right? That's the original purpose of marriage, is to provide a basis on which to have children. Whereas now the connection is not at all obvious. It's seen as a sort of means of self-fulfillment, maybe an accomplishment, in that you found your forever person. It's not seen as a precondition of family formation.
Hopefully things get better. I think things are going to get better. It felt like things were going to get worse in 2018, and I feel like things are getting better now. I think the popularity in some of these more traditional ideas and the acceptance of them, things have split more, but I feel like there are more people talking about, hey, having a family is okay. Wanting to be a stay-at-home mom is okay. Kids are great. Like, I think it's more popular, I hope. And I think men are getting more interested in the idea as well. I think. Or I could just be in a bubble.
I think you're right. I think there's something happening. Someone said to me the other day that if you had written this book 10 years ago, it would have been a flop. But this seems to be, for some reason, a moment where I haven't had very much negative response, actually, not at all.
Cool. That's cool.
Overwhelmingly positive, and so much bigger than I thought as well. I get emails several times a day from people who are saying, wow, this book has had such an impact on me. And I sort of feel like I'm just saying obvious stuff, but I think that we're living in a time where the obvious stuff needs to be said.
Agreed. Okay, so where can people go to find your book, and where can people go online to find you?
So best place to find me is on Twitter. So I'm at Louise_M_Perry. And the book is called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century. And it came out like 2 weeks ago in the States, and is available all over the world, and is about to be translated into a bunch of other languages. But for now, it's just in English.
That is so cool. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.